Ho, ho, ho. Happy holidays, listeners. And don't forget to like and subscribe to The Deep Dive. Tonight, we're going to be unwrapping the biggest Christmas present of all, the real story of Santa Claus.
We're going way beyond the milk and cookies version you grew up with.
Oh, yeah. Our source for this deep dive is a book called Santa Claus, Last of the Wild Men. And I got to tell you, it is going to blow your mind wide open. This is not just about some jolly saint. We're talking ancient rituals, pagan gods, and a connection to Christmas that's deeper and wilder than you ever imagined.
Get ready to have your childhood beliefs challenged.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this. Most people think Santa's just a friendly version of St. Nicholas, right?
Right, but when you really dig into the St. Nicholas legend, you find there's a darker, more complex side that often gets overlooked.
Yeah, the book mentions this birch rod that St. Nick carries around, and then there's Black Pete, his sidekick, who's supposed to punish naughty children. It's definitely a far cry from the jolly old elf we see in shopping malls.
Exactly. And some of the St. Nicholas stories are, well, they're pretty bizarre. There's one where he brings 3 butchered schoolboys back to life.
Wait, what? He resurrects them.
Yes. And then the story says that St. Nicholas actually forgives the butcher who killed them.
Okay, that's pretty intense.
Yeah.
Not exactly the image of Santa we're used to.
It really makes you wonder if there's more to this Santa Claus story than we've been told.
So, if St. Nicholas isn't the whole story, where does this idea of a wild man come in?
Well, the book introduces us to this character called Pelsnickel. He's the Pennsylvania Dutch version of Santa. And trust me, he's nothing like the Santa we know and love. This guy is described as hairy, often terrifying, and he dresses in furs with a blackened face.
Wow, that's not exactly someone you'd want coming down your chimney. He sounds more like a creature from a horror movie than a jolly gift giver.
Right. And what's really interesting is that Pelsnickel is connected to this much older figure, an ancient figure from European folklore called the Wild Man. It suggests that the roots of Santa Claus go way, way back, long before Christianity.
So we're talking pagan origins.
Exactly. The Wild Man represents the raw, untamed forces of nature. He embodies the cycle of death and rebirth, and he's often associated with the wilderness, the forest, the unknown.
Okay, so we're talking about a powerful, primal figure, not just some cute little elf. But how does this terrifying wild man figure evolve into the Santa we know today?
That's a fascinating journey. It involves centuries of cultural and religious transformation.
So spill the tea. How did this wild man get tamed and turned into a jolly old elf?
Well, as Christianity spread throughout Europe, the wild man, with his pagan roots, started to be seen as a threat. His attributes, his hairiness, his horns, his club became associated with the devil. It's almost like they demonized him to fit into their worldview.
That's interesting. So they took this powerful, even scary figure
Yeah.
and tried to make it more palatable for a Christian audience.
Exactly. But even though they tried to demonize him, the wild man didn't just disappear. His influence persisted in various forms, often disguised or transformed.
So it's like he went underground but never really went away.
That's a great way to put it. You see these traces of the wild man in some unexpected places. For example, the book talks about British mumming plays, which were these popular folk performances. They often featured themes of death and resurrection, just like the wild man cycle. But instead of the wild man as the central figure, you have the fool, a sort of silly, less threatening version.
So the wild man spirit lived on, but in a more comedic, acceptable form.
Right. And it's not just the fool. You can also see echoes of the wild man in figures like Robin Goodfellow, the mischievous sprite from English folklore, and even Robin Hood, the outlaw who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor.
Wait, Robin Hood? I know never would have connected him with Santa Claus, but now that you mention it, I can see the similarities. They both have this rebellious spirit and this sense of giving back to the community.
Exactly. And speaking of rebellion and wild rides, the book delves into this concept of the wild hunt and the wild horde. I think this will really blow your mind.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are the wild hunt and the wild horde?
Imagine a terrifying procession led by figures like Odin, the Norse god, or King Waldemar, this legendary Danish king. These nocturnal rides, often accompanied by storms and the howling of hounds, were thought to bring misfortune to anyone who crossed their path.
Wow, that sounds intense, like something out of a nightmare.
It was, and these wild hunts were often associated with the winter solstice, a time of darkness and rebirth. They were a reminder of the power of nature and the unpredictability of fate.
So how does this tie back to Santa Claus?
Well, think about it. You have the supernatural being traveling through the night sky, bringing both gifts and a sense of awe and fear. It's not hard to see the parallels between the Wild Hunt and Santa Claus's sleigh ride.
Wow, that's a really interesting connection. So even though we've sanitized Santa's image
Mhm.
and turned him into this jolly old elf, there are still hints of his wilder, more primal origins lurking beneath the surface.
Exactly, and the book goes even deeper, exploring the connections between fairies, elves, and gift-giving. And trust me, it's not all sugar plums and candy canes.
Okay, I'm sensing a pattern here. What's the dark side of elves and fairies? They're not all Tinkerbell and happy thoughts, are they?
Well, in many cultures, fairies and elves weren't just cute little creatures. They were seen as powerful beings, capable of both great kindness and terrible mischief.
Like those tricky leprechauns, always guarding their pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
Exactly. The book shares stories of helpful household spirits, like the kobold in Germany and the domovoi in Slavic folklore. These spirits would perform chores and protect the home, but they expected rewards for their services. If they were neglected or disrespected, bad things could happen.
So they weren't exactly selfless little helpers, more like demanding roommates with magical powers.
You could say that. And this all reflects a time when fairies and elves were viewed with a mixture of respect and fear. You never knew what they might do.
So they were a force to be reckoned with, not
Yeah.
just cute little decorations for Christmas trees.
Right. And speaking of powerful beings, we haven't even talked about the female side of the story yet. So far, we've mostly been discussing male figures, like the wild man, St. Nicholas, and the squirrel, and these mischievous elves and goblins.
Yeah, where are the women in all of this? Don't tell me they were just baking cookies while the guys were out having all the fun.
Oh, there are definitely some powerful women in this story, and their roles are just as fascinating and complex as the men's. The book introduces us to figures like Holda, Perchta, and the Disseer, who are all associated with the wild man and play key roles in fertility rituals and gift-giving.
Hold up, that name rings a bell. Isn't she that German folklore figure who flies through the sky?
Yes, she's often associated with winter, witchcraft, and spinning. In some stories, she even leads the wild hunt. But what's important here is that these female figures weren't just sidekicks to the wild man. They had their own power, their own agency, and their own stories to tell.
So they weren't just passive bystanders. They were active participants in this ancient magical world.
Absolutely, and their stories are just as complex and intriguing as the wild man's.
Okay, this is also fascinating. It's like peeling back the layers of history and discovering a whole new world beneath the surface.
That's what's so great about this book. It challenges our assumptions about Christmas and reveals these deep, hidden connections that we never knew existed.
So it's more than just a Christmas story. It's a story about humanity's relationship with nature, with the unknown, and with the power of belief.
Exactly. And as we continue our deep dive into Santa Claus, Last of the Wild Men, we'll explore how these seemingly disparate threads, the wild man, the fairies, the goddesses, all weave together to create the holiday we celebrate today.
I can't wait to see where this journey takes us. Listeners, stay tuned because there's much more to come.
So, as we're talking about these powerful women from folklore, it's interesting to see how they, just like the wild man, underwent a transformation as Christianity rose to power.
So they weren't immune to the forces of cultural change.
Not at all. In fact, these goddesses and other female figures were often demonized and associated with witchcraft.
It's like they were seen as a threat to the established order, so they had to be discredited or vilified in some way.
That's a great point. And the book actually reinterprets some familiar historical events, like Lady Godiva's famous ride, connecting them back to these ancient traditions of riding goddesses.
Wow, that's really making me rethink history. So instead of just seeing Lady Godiva as this noblewoman making a sacrifice, we can see her as part of this much older, more complex tradition of powerful women connected to nature and fertility.
Exactly. And this reinterpretation adds a whole new layer of meaning to her story.
Okay, so we've talked about the wild man, fairies, goddesses, and how they were all transformed or demonized as Christianity spread. But what about Christmas itself? How did all of this ancient pagan stuff become part of the holiday we celebrate today?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And as we delve deeper into Santa Claus, Last of the Wild Men, we start to see some really fascinating connections. One of the most mind-blowing revelations in this book is the idea that prehistoric European civilizations were far more sophisticated than we often give them credit for.
You mean those people who lived thousands of years ago, before written history, I always thought of them as kind of primitive,
Oh,
living in
yeah.
caves and hunting with spears. But this book suggests something different.
Exactly. It challenges that simplistic view of prehistory and argues that these ancient cultures had complex rituals, beliefs, and social structures. They had a deep understanding of nature and the cosmos, and they developed sophisticated ways of interacting with the world around them.
So it's not just about survival and brute force. There's a whole layer of meaning and symbolism that we're only beginning to understand.
Right. And one of the key aspects of these prehistoric cultures was their relationship with the wild man. He was more than just a figure of mythology. He was central to their rituals and beliefs, representing the raw power and unpredictable nature of the world.
Okay, so we're starting to see how the wild man is connected to these ancient civilizations and their belief systems. But how does this tie back to Christmas?
Well, one of the key threads that connects the wild man to Christmas is the tradition of gift giving. As we discussed earlier, those early wild men, fairies, and household spirits were often associated with bestowing gifts or blessings.
Right, but those gifts often came with strings attached, like demands for respect or even threats of punishment. It wasn't exactly the pure selfless giving that we associate with Christmas.
Exactly. It was a very different kind of gift giving than what we're used to today. But over time, as the wild man was tamed and Christianity's influence grew, those gift-giving traditions began to evolve. The rewards for good behavior became more emphasized, and the punishments for bad behavior became less severe.
So a bit more carrot and a little less stick, like be good for goodness sake instead of you better watch out.
Exactly. And as the image of the gift giver shifted from a fearsome figure to a more benevolent one, the focus shifted from appeasement to generosity and goodwill.
That makes sense. It's like Christmas became a way to celebrate those values of kindness and compassion.
And it's fascinating to see how those values are rooted in traditions that are far older than Christmas itself. We've inherited this rich tapestry of beliefs and practices that have been woven together over centuries.
So it's not just about Santa and presents. It's about tapping into this ancient human desire for connection, for celebration, and for giving back to the community.
Right. And speaking of ancient traditions, the book introduces us to this fascinating group of people called the Ainu, who live in northern Japan.
The Ainu, I've never heard of them. What makes them so special?
Well, for starters, they have some striking similarities to descriptions of fairies. They're described as short, stocky, and incredibly hairy, with deep-set eyes. And their ancient bear rituals and oral traditions suggest that they might hold clues to the fate of the fairies.
Wait, so you're saying the Ainu could be descendants of fairies? That they're like living remnants of this ancient magical world?
The book definitely leaves that possibility open. It's a tantalizing thought, isn't it? That this ancient, almost mythical people might be living among us today, carrying on traditions that stretch back thousands of years.
Mind officially blown. I'm definitely going to have to do some more research on the Ainu after this. It's amazing to think that there are still these pockets
Yeah.
of ancient culture and beliefs that exist in the world today.
It's a reminder that the past is never truly past. It's always there, influencing the present, in ways that we may not even realize. And speaking of the past influencing the present, let's bring this back to Christmas. We've been on this incredible journey, exploring the wild man, fairies, goddesses, ancient rituals, and even the Ainu people. But how did all of this come together to create the holiday we celebrate today?
Yeah, I'm still trying to wrap my head around all of this. It's like this epic puzzle where all these seemingly unrelated pieces are suddenly starting to fit together.
Right. And as we continue our deep dive into Santa Claus, Last of the Wild Men, we'll see how these pieces come together to form a complete picture.
So we've explored the wild man, fairies, goddesses, ancient rituals, even the Ainu people. It's like this incredible tapestry of history and mythology, and it's all connected to Christmas.
It is truly remarkable how these threads intertwine over centuries, creating the holiday we know today.
But how did we go from these like hairy, terrifying figures running through the streets to a jolly old elf delivering presents?
Well, as we've discussed, the tradition of gift-giving is key. Those early wild men, fairies, and household spirits were often associated with bestowing gifts or blessings.
Right, but those gifts often came with strings attached, demands for respect or even threats of punishment. It wasn't exactly the pure, selfless giving that we associate with Christmas.
Precisely. It was a very different kind of gift-giving. But over time, as the wild man was tamed and Christianity's influence grew, those gift-giving traditions began to evolve. The rewards for good behavior became more prominent, and the punishments for bad behavior became less severe.
So a bit more carrot and a little less stick, like be good for goodness sake instead of you better watch out.
Exactly. And as the image of the gift giver shifted from a fearsome figure to a more benevolent one, the focus shifted from appeasement to generosity and goodwill.
That makes sense. It's like Christmas became a way to celebrate those values of kindness and compassion.
And it's fascinating to see how those values are rooted in traditions that are far older than Christmas itself. We've inherited this rich tapestry of beliefs and practices that have been woven together over centuries.
So it's not just about Santa and presents. It's about tapping into this ancient human desire for connection, celebration, and giving back.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And when we understand these deeper roots, it really enriches our experience of Christmas.
So what does all this mean for us today? Does understanding Santa's wild origins change our perception of Christmas?
I think it can deepen our appreciation for the holiday. Christmas is a tapestry woven from pagan traditions, ancient myths, Christian beliefs, and centuries of cultural evolution. It's not a simple story. It's a complex and layered one.
It's like all those layers of history are all baked into the fruitcake of Christmas. Some people love it, some people hate it, but it's got all these different ingredients that make it what it is.
I love that analogy. And as we celebrate with loved ones, exchanging gifts and sharing traditions, it's worth remembering the long and fascinating journey that brought us to this moment.
Absolutely. Well, folks, we've reached the end of our Christmas Eve deep dive into the origins of Santa Claus. A huge thanks to Santa Claus, Last of the Wild Men, for taking us on this wild ride through history and folklore.
And to you, dear listener, for joining us on this journey of discovery.
We hope you've enjoyed this festive exploration. Happy holidays in Taisley. And don't forget to check out the show notes for more information on the source material. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.